podcast about product management, user experience design, technology, and more. This is Product by Design. All right, welcome to another episode of Product by Design. I am Kyle, and this week we have another great guest with us, Dorothy Shamonsky, Ph.D. joining us. Dorothy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm really glad to be here.
We're excited to have you and excited to talk about a number of things from your background and have you discuss some of what you've been working on and the things that you've worked on through your career with us. But let me introduce Dorothy briefly. So Dorothy is the UX Strategy Officer at Massachusetts-based Integrated Computer Solutions, ICS, and its design studio, Boston UX. And Dorothy has an extensive background in UX design, has worked with a number of companies. But Dorothy, why don't you tell us more about your background and what you are doing right now as well?
Well, I'm going to kind of start at the beginning because I think it's important. I have an undergraduate degree in sculpture with a minor in design. And you could say that I came from a background of the love of form and form making. I've always had an interest in the notion of ideal forms, golden ratios, such as things like that, and how those forms resonate through art and design and also through natural systems. And also that they can represent a possible universal aesthetic. I'm also interested in the symbolism of forms and semiotics, how people find meaning in forms. So for me, form is a big topic, and it's how we create beauty, feeling, meaning, and communication in the things that we make. So I bring all that to the design of UX. I'm also fond of mathematics and how numbers and equations define form. So it's mathematics that led me to computers. I became interested in computer graphics programming with the idea of creating virtual sculptures. And this was like around 1980. So I learned how to do some programming. And then I combined those interests and ended up in a graduate program at MIT in the Media Lab. And there I was developing software design tools for designers. And so it was through that writing of software design tools that I became interested in interface design. So I was involved in interface design from the beginning when it was very crude still. This is the early days of graphical user interfaces, mid-1980s, around the time that the Mac first came out. But I've always retained a perspective that interface design will eventually get to be really good and really easy to interact with. And so, sort of like interacting with another human or with an animal or with the physical world as we know it. So I kind of look at everything that we've been doing as UX designers over the past 4 decades as still quite primitive and just moving in the direction of getting us to a better and a better and a better place. And so if you, again, kind of put that all together, I'm really interested in the experience of how interacting with technology impacts people. People are multisensory, emotional, physical. They have a sophisticated, multi-level consciousness and mental processing ability. So even with the constraints of the current interfaces that we're working on, there's just a huge number of details and options that a designer can work with in order to create great usability.
That's an amazing background. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about some of the experience that you have and how that's influenced, what you're doing now, some of the journey that you've taken and where it's brought you, especially I think the fascinating role that you talked about, about this idea of almost the more artistic side of design, the form, and then the mathematics side, which I feel like is such a really the intersection of design. And I think that's incredible. But before we do dive into more of that, and I'm excited to, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you like to do outside of the office and outside of design?
Well, I keep pretty busy because I'm curious about the world. So I read voraciously. I spend time outdoors walking, both in nature and even, in the city or in towns. Sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. I grow a garden. I'm really interested in kind of what's happening in the world, politics, culture. Since I have a background in art, I still like to make things, so I kind of do a lot of stuff by hand just because I enjoy doing it that way. And I also volunteer in our town for events, town events, community events, and, things in the government and the town government sometimes. So, and then I have a extended family that we all get together pretty often for dinners.
Yeah, no, that's a lot. You have a number of spoons and items in your background. Do you make those?
Well, so that is actually one of my sculptures that I made. That was actually made maybe early 90s. So I was already had my higher degrees from MIT and was working on some technology projects, but I was still pretty actively doing sculpture as well. So that was just an experiment where I took a bunch of wooden spoons. I had a little jigsaw, and I just would cut the spoon with the jigsaw and try to come up with as many possible configurations of cutting that I could. So it was just like, how many different ways can I cut this spoon to make another shape? It was a really fun project. And so it was one of the few sculptures that I still have.
Very nice. Okay. So hopefully for anybody who gets a chance to see some of the video, you can see some of the sculpture in the background, and you'll definitely want to check that out. Okay. Well, I'm excited to dive into some of the background and things that you talked about, and maybe you can expand a little bit more on that. So you talked about your background and some of the things that you worked on, and a little bit about your journey. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what it is that you're working on now. What is it that brought you to some of the things that you're doing now, and what are those things?
Well, so I've always been interested in staying with emerging technologies. So I worked in a research lab for a while at MIT, and then I was brought onto a project at MoMA. And this is back in the late 80s when they wanted to experiment with putting a computer kiosk in one of their galleries. So that was really a fun project, maybe because it was combining art with interface design and technology at the time. Then I worked at MTV on interactive television in the early 90s when interactive television was like the hot thing, and all the TV stations were trying to scramble and figure out, we got to get prototypes going or we're going to be left behind. And then I've also done a fair amount of teaching at the college level in different places, Pratt Institute, NYU. I teach part-time at Brandeis now. I've ended up realizing that I really like being a practitioner. And when I had my kids, it was really nice to be in a company that was family friendly. And I like working in a small company. I like working in companies that sort of operate like startups. That's how I ended up at ICS and Boston UX, because it fits that criteria. I feel very at home there.
Right.
Boston UX works mostly on embedded projects, IoT, things that relate to, medical devices, which can be embedded. A lot of these projects can be embedded, or they can be a more broad-based in terms of being on several platforms. or they, sometimes they're just web-based tools, but they often are focused on the medical field, industrial, robotics, which is part of industrial.
Right. When you focus on, so I think that that's a fascinating area to focus on, especially from a UX perspective, because one, it's such an important area when we talk about medical devices and robotics. And it's also, I feel like it must add another layer of challenge to both the user experience and a lot of the design, because you're all of a sudden, you're not just dealing part of it you're dealing in, in some of just the normal user interface, but you're also dealing in, potentially higher stakes in a lot of cases. Is that what you found? And what are some of the similarities and maybe some of the differences that you found as you're working in this space and in, robotics and the medical field and some of these other areas?
Well, where there's safety involved, then safety is top of the list in terms of importance. You can imagine if you're having a medical procedure and the doctor makes a mistake because they don't understand because the interface confuses them in the device that they're using, and you're not going to be happy with that situation. So lack of safety in certain areas can definitely cause harm, and that would be medical devices, automobiles, vehicles, or any kind of transportation related, crane operation, and then robotics. Certain amount of robotics has safety issues. They vary depending on the type of robot being used. And so what's maybe interesting about that is that where safety is a concern, and usually there's a regulation related to that companies have to conform to. It doesn't mean that the whole usability is great as a result, because usually those companies, they really only care about meeting the regulations, and they can vary in terms of whether they care about any of the rest of usability. And I'm a big fan of creating systems that don't require a lot of training. And it seems particularly important if you think about a medical device, the less training involved. I mean, it's not training, less training is a money saving strategy, but it also, again, seems like it's going to just make it easier to use this device. There'll be less opportunities for problems to arise, but it's not always the case. It really depends on the particular company and product and how their priorities fall out. And so anyway, that's been kind of an interesting thing to me to understand, that there's a lot of different aspects of usability, and different places are going to have different priorities in that usability spectrum. As UX designers, we hope that we can do it all, but it's not always part of the budget or the time frame. So
how do you balance that? Because I feel like a lot of times regulations, where at least in my mind, I feel like they should be the minimum requirement. And a lot of times, kind of like you mentioned, they become the bar to hit. And once you've done that, then you've reached what you need. From a usability perspective, that then becomes oftentimes less than a great experience, because you've reached what a lot of people view as the requirement. How do you approach either those conversations of, what makes for a good experience versus just hitting certain requirements? And then how do you design around, things that have maybe lots of regulations or lots of, specific requirements that may kind of constrain the UX experience in certain ways, so that they meet the requirements, but also, you want to design them in a way that make them very usable for the people who will actually be involved in it. How do you balance all of that?
Well, so first off, I would say that the constraints of the regulation don't ever conflict with other kinds of usability. It only adds to it. So I am actually a regulation fan because I think all regulation improves the consumer or the user experience. I mean, just like people can think seat belts, are annoying, but they save lives. It's like, that's a good thing. So I'm very pro-regulation. I think in some cases the regulations probably could be stronger than they are. In terms of what's interesting, I find is that it's hard to ever convince clients with words about that they should be doing more or thinking about more. Putting more effort into their the usability of their product. But if you can slip in showing them something, and it's not actually that hard to do it, because when you're designing, you can do a lot, with little time. If you're designing and already designing certain things, you can make other things good at the same time. So once they see something is successful with users, such as, for example, they can pick up how to use something quicker than the client would have expected because the interface allows them to do that, then the client is all of a sudden, this is great. Can we do more of it? And they're really happy about that. So it's all about making them happy with, it's like working within the initial budget that you get, making the most of it. And then hopefully, the goal would be from that, they see what you've done and they're like, yeah, wow, I like that. Yeah. Let's do more.
Yeah. I think you've touched on a great point on being able to really demonstrate the importance and efficacy of good user experience. And I'd love to hear more about maybe how you have done that, because I feel like as so many of us, have really worked in, the product and UX space, this is kind of an ongoing challenge of how do we really demonstrate the value of good UX and of good design in a product where there may be, budget constraints or time constraints or other constraints that, people feel like we just don't have time, or there's just not the value to put in as much into the design or the user experience. We just need to do something. So I'd love your thoughts on, how have you done this? How have you approached this problem to show that there really is, a lot of value in putting in the time and effort into the thoughtfulness behind the UX and behind the design and a lot of the flows that go into some of this user design and experience?
Well, I want to preface it with saying that a lot of the embedded projects that we work on are, in an industrial setting, they're about getting work done or going through a particular process. So they're productive applications. And so it's potentially easier to see the effect of a good interface than it is when you're doing some other apps, and also, there's just something very concrete about, creating an app that replaces a process in a manufacturing plant, and then they're using that app to potentially, make that process more efficient. It's like very, very measurable. So that's an advantage. So that's the first thing is we're in a good place to do that. But I just have to say that good usability, you achieve it just through good design. So you just have to go through this, the steps of good design, which again, in our case, we're looking at how users do tasks without the app that we're creating for them, first off, or with what they might have now. They might have an older application that they're working with. So evaluating how they're getting things done right now and trying to determine like what would make that more efficient or what makes it efficient. So what works for the user is just really important. So it's all about understanding the user. And then we do focus a lot on workflows in those kind of applications where you're doing a process, and, really think through like what is the workflow, and are there ways to do it better? And then the interface needs to represent those workflows. When you determine what a good workflow is, then the interface needs to represent that workflow really clearly. Readability is a big issue for us because industrial environments can be different in terms of lighting, noise. You might be standing, you might, like, who knows, like all different kinds of setups that people are in. So we have to pay a lot of attention to, can this screen have good readability given the light conditions that someone might be in or the angle that they might be using the device. So those kind of things. That's it.
Yeah. I think that's great. And you've touched on something else that I'm interested in. How do you approach some of this research that you do? You mentioned really understanding users and understanding some of the processes and flows in order to address some of these problems or some of these usability issues. How do you go about understanding that? Obviously each company or each application is probably different, but as you go in, as you start to do some of this initial research and understanding, what are some of the steps that you take in order to go in and really start to look at the problems and look at the environment and create some of these this understanding initially in order to address some of the things that you're going to be doing as you get into creating the UX and creating some of the products that you're designing?
I think that our methods are pretty standard, in that you're observing. We do a lot of just talking through the processes that people use and why they use certain steps or processes that they use to achieve a goal. We don't even get to visit some of the sites where devices might be being used. So we might get someone on site to take videos of people using devices currently. So we kind of use anything we can to like see everything about what's going on and different people using a device as well. So that, because they might use it in a different way or at a different speed or whatever, The other thing is, of course, I always want hands-on myself if any way possible, because feeling through the process myself, it's really informative to me. I mean, if I'm working on, say, a welding robot arm, and maybe again, because I feel comfortable with machinery and, tools that you make things with, for me to get in there and try to do that with the robot arm myself is, very informative to me. I can, just feel the sense of like something is too far away, to really find it comfortable, or some button is really hard to push, that's on the robot and it messes up what's happening on the interface, just those kind of more subtle things. So I would say that's basically what we do. It's true that the domains, like we're working in really unique domains that have a lot of special knowledge behind them. And so we have to kind of get up to speed with that domain on a lot of projects, like we're not going to become electrical engineers, but, or crane operators, but it's like we have to know enough about the domain in order to design. And that is part of every project. Like I want to say like a quarter of the budget can be, I'm just like understanding all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, what are some of the things that you do and your team does in order to understand some of those things? Because obviously, like you can't become an electrical engineer or a crane operator, for each new project, but how do you get some of that understanding? Is it, obviously through some of the discussions and some of the visits and on-site? Are there other things that you do to kind of really understand and empathize and learn the space as well?
Besides all the stuff I just talked about, I'd say watching YouTube videos, and often that involves like sometimes watching YouTube videos of competitive products as well. That's a good way to see like, what is somebody else doing in a similar kind of product? Gives us ideas. And reading their user manuals, which can be pretty boring. And that's probably about it, really.
I feel like I've gone through a lot of documentation as I've come up to speed on a lot of different areas, and that it's not always the most exciting reading, but it can be incredibly valuable because I feel like that's where a lot of the details is in the documentation in a lot of places. And obviously YouTube and other videos are just really, really great resources. I think that's great. Yeah. I want to zoom out just a little bit as well. You talked earlier about the UX industry and you being part of that from a very, very early stage, when GUIs were just a very, very early thing. And, now being in what you say is still an early phase of UX, and we're still with rudimentary tools. I'm interested in, what have you seen over the course of your career as far as the state of UX? Where are we now? And where do you see things going in the future?
Where we are now, I guess maybe this is a question of what's changed since I started. And I would say one of the interesting things is that there's a lot more people doing UX design, but they have a lot less training. So like 25 years ago, most of my colleagues had master's degrees and possibly PhDs. Nowadays, you meet people that took a couple courses and then they got a job as a UX designer. So that's really different. On the flip side of that, there's a lot more technologies that don't require a lot of training that you can be designing. I mean, I would say, designing for the web in general depends on what you're doing, because the web does have a broad spectrum to it. But, putting together some websites is way easier than working on some other kinds of projects, like a medical device, say. So different skill levels are required given the spectrum of products that are out there. And also there's a lot more support tools and a lot of tools. There's a lot of libraries of, code components, as well as, icon libraries, like all that kind of stuff. The best practices are more developed and more well understood. So lots of support material to help people. It does feel to me like corporations kind of own UX design these days, which wasn't the case years ago. It felt like technology dominated design, and that may still be the case in some ways, but feels like corporations have really come in, and that's where many or maybe most UX designers work, and that the corporate model is what determines a lot of how, the organization of design teams. And that seems unfortunate to me, I guess, because I come out of more of like a studio tradition. It also allows people to do it and be employed. So, so that's the flip side of that.
It is. And I'm interested, what do you see as, maybe some of the big differences, studio design versus corporate design? Obviously, we can probably name off a bunch, but what are the differences for you, and some of the shift that you've seen as we've moved more in that direction over the last probably few decades, but as it shifted in that direction?
I think it's just that corporations are interested in efficiency and also managing employees. So I'm a generalist because I had to be, coming up where I came through the process. Corporations don't really care for generalists. They like specialists. And it has to do with, in some ways, just what they they can pay less for less skills, in a sense. So I think that people become more specialized but isolated in their skill. And also, so people are more siloed in a way in corporations. There's less collaboration. When you work in a design studio, there's more, everybody knows more, and there's more collaboration among everyone. There's more of a love of, you're doing it because you love design versus it's a 9-to-5. Corporations kind of force you into this 9-to-5 mentality. That's how I would see the difference.
You've just like opened up a whole like area of thought for me that I want to like explore, but I don't think we're going to have time, of not just design, but the specialization and siloing of just about everything as we've industrialized most of the skills. It feels like, I mean, design is obviously a very, very apparent one, but it feels like we've industrialized a lot of things and kind of siloed so many different areas and specialized. And there's probably benefits to some of that as far as both the specialization and some of the abilities to do things, specific things, but then you also lose so much of the generalized skill set and the abilities to move across domains that we used to have, that I think is just so critical to see across so many of the different areas and skill sets that we're not seeing as frequently, and that you can often put different things together from different areas. And I could jump on that soapbox for a long time, but we'll try not to, but I think that that's an amazingly good point.
Yeah. And I think it makes better designers when they can have that broad view. So I think, it's one of the things that is kind of missing now more and more.
Yeah. Is there a way to get back to that?
Well, so maybe, I guess, what's also changed is that, the tech world was really optimistic back in the 80s and 90s. And really, with the advent of social media, the tech world is becoming less and less seen as going to save the world. I think, designers have become more cynical, but I think they're not cynical enough. I think that they actually need to take the damage that technology is doing to society more seriously. So I think that if designers can kind of rally to make good for the world rather than be just following directions and doing what they're told to do, like, hey, we want to get out this product, do the design on it. Like, designers need to have ethics. They need to understand sustainability. And so I think that designers do need to change their viewpoint to be thinking more about how do we fix these problems rather than being part of the problem. And so I think there's hope there. And also I think in that process, it would solve some of the issues that we talked about. I'm not sure that it would, solve them completely, but that it would bring more of a wholeness to the profession. I feel like we don't have right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's an amazingly good point on design specifically, and probably many of the other disciplines within technology and within the product development in general. It's not just about creating the thing. It's about what is the broader impact of the thing on everybody, and how could we make sure that we're taking that into account. So I absolutely love that. That's that's a great point.
Thanks. So let's talk about the future a little bit. Because there's kind of two futures that are clear, which is this more optimistic one that I kind of just described a little bit. And then there's artificial intelligence is going to destroy us all future. And that actually seems like a real concern. I take that pretty seriously. I want to acknowledge the work of, there's a certain group of UX designers who have been talking about human-centered artificial intelligence. And I think that's a really great movement. Ben Schneiderman in particular has been trying to lead some of that. I think it's, it's a serious issue. And I think UX designers need to educate themselves about artificial intelligence, not to know how to program it, but to understand its implications. Because we will have a certain amount of power to do something positive if people are informed. So that's one thing. I know you've brought up robots a few times, and I know I've heard this phrase a few times, which is that in the future, all devices are going to be robots. And I also pretty much agree with that. And obviously the implication is when you have a robot, you also have some level of artificial intelligence. So that's an interesting picture, I think, of what the future could be. And it's really all about shaping the technology in a way that works well for people and the planet. And that's a kind of, future vision that I think is probably, I think the robots is real, and whether they're leaning toward evil or good or both. And then there's going to be a fight between them. that is honestly where we're headed.
Absolutely. And I think you've hit on a great point that sometimes it's easy to overlook as we're looking at the future of both robotics and AI, is that these things are going to have a major impact on us, on what we're doing, obviously within our roles in our work and things that we're doing, but we also are going to have a major impact on how those things are going to impact not only us, but broader society. And we get to influence those things as well, whether that, like you mentioned, is going to be for the better or for the worse. And kind of like you talked about, that is probably coming sooner than we think. I think that one of the things for me is it's an unknown right now. And that's probably the big point is for me anyway, we just don't know. And that's the big question is we don't know what the impact is, and we don't know when it is. And so we need to start really, really considering hard how we're using it, how we're going to influence it, and what we're going to do with this, because it's not something we can continue to push off into the future. This isn't a future problem. It's very much a now problem. And that is, and again, at least from my perspective, we just don't know what a lot of the implications are, but we need to start thinking hard about them because they are coming very, very quickly. As we've seen, it feels like every day is a new deluge of what new technologies and new things that we could list a whole bunch, but within a couple of days, it would just be a whole bunch more. So it's both exciting, but also kind of like you mentioned, a lot of potential scary things as well.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I've been interested for a while in is the idea of NUIs, or natural user interfaces. NUIs are hard, I think, for a lot of people to understand because it's a vague concept. Basically, a NUI is anything that's more sophisticated than a standard GUI. And when I say standard GUI, I mean mouse and keyboard interaction with a screen, with a non-touch screen, essentially. That kind of opens up this what is it? It's like, can be anything. a touch screens are considered NUIs. Voice is considered NUI. So that means that phones and tablets are actually NUIs. But it doesn't have that kind of clear separation. Like a NUI can have a GUI or be a GUI, but it's a GUI that's touch or has other capabilities. And so it's really anything that allows humans to interact in more natural ways than they can than just with the classic GUI. And so then a lot of people look at that and go, well, so what? That sounds like meaningless. Who cares? It's like, so you add things onto the GUI and you end up with a phone or, a tablet or a kiosk. But I think that there's a conceptual part to it, which is a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about interfaces. And it's that the goal is to move past the classic GUI to something that is more natural for humans. Like the GUI was amazing and revolutionary at its invention in the 1960s compared to a command line interface. But it still is a way of interacting with a machine that is a layer of control Chrome, basically. It's all these constructs like input fields and buttons that are kind of derived from machine interfaces. And we can assume that we're going to get to a point where we don't need those things anymore, that the technology is more accessible to us. So there's a book that was written around 2010 called Brave New World. The authors, I have them written down. The authors are Wigdor and Wixon. And their definition of NUI was you're interacting with content itself rather than with the controls to interact with content. That's also kind of hard to understand. Like when you think, okay, well, what's an example of that? I think of like a touch screen where, let's say you have a news article and on a touch screen, it's represented kind of like a little newspaper with the headline and a few words. And then you can actually tap on it and it expands into a whole page, compared to maybe on a mouse controlled interface, you would have a link that says the news article name, and then you select the link, or there's a button that's read this news article. So it's really subtle, but it's still going from I'm not interacting with a control, I'm interacting with something that is representing that actual content. And if you start thinking that way and you start looking at your interfaces that you've designed and say, well, can I interact more directly with the content rather than the controls? You can, particularly on touch systems, you can find ways to do that. And again, this is the whole thing I think about usability, is that it really deals with so many subtleties that make an interface good or better in terms of usability. And I think that's one reason why even usability is hard to understand for a lot of people, is that it's like if you're doing 3 clicks instead of 1 click, or if you're doing a swipe instead of a tap, it's better for the user. It's easier. It's less painful. It's less cognitive overload, even if it's just like a teeny bit. But that multiple versions of that is what creates good usability. And multiple versions of not having that is what creates like the friction and the frustration and the stress and investment in trying to interact with technology. So that whole idea of interacting with content is, I think, an interesting one. It's also kind of a limited definition, but it's pretty interesting. Another way I like to think about it is if you could create a system that a caveman and woman could understand, because it's using what is natural to humans in the interface, then that's a more natural system than a classic GUI, or even, whatever systems we're using today, a caveman and woman might need training on it because it's just too foreign compared to the real world. So it's like getting interactivity to be more like the real world. So that's also where we're heading. Obviously, that applies completely to robotics and artificial intelligence. That those two things support that completely. So
I think you've brought up, some amazing points, and I'm interested in, because what you've touched on is, I have fingerprints all over all of my screens here because my kids will come in and touch my laptop or touch my monitor, expecting it to be touchscreen because that's what they know. Mm-hmm. And it's a foreign concept to them to use a mouse or a touchpad to scroll on a screen. They're not accustomed to that. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing, kind of like you talked about, more and more integration of NUIs into everything, to the point where it is this idea of a graphical user interface where we're using more of these traditional things that many of us are used to will probably go away at some point. Mm-hmm. And we're going to have more and more of these natural interfaces. What do you see as the evolution of that? Like, what does that become for the things that we're using, or even the next generation of technology, whether that's robotics or AI or whatever's coming next? How do you see that evolving?
Well, I think a really obvious thing is we're going to have androids that look like humans and interact with us like humans. Like, that's definitely a goal. I think that there's situations where things on screens are always going to be valuable, like certain kind of information. I mean, if we think about, books are really valuable, chalkboards or whiteboards are really valuable, spreadsheets are really valuable, like all these things that are about showing information in a representative way with drawings or numbers, and also, of course, text. All those are valuable, and they're not going to go away 100%. But I do think that they're going to exist in ways that are just as painless as possible to interact with. Books are still really easy to interact with. They don't give you all the advantages of, reading on a Kindle, but they still are super easy to interact with and comfortable. I think seeing things like electronic whiteboards that don't have too many gadgets related to them is, that's like a fairly natural way to go. And like I said, I think we'll always have screens of some kind. They may eventually all be touch screens, pretty much. I think it's going to be things that blend with the natural environment more, or with the physical environment more than they do now. They won't be this separate. Oh, here's a computer, here's a whiteboard. It'll just be a technology where every whiteboard is live and connected, and you draw on it, and that's it,
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe it's savable or sendable.
Yeah. No, I can definitely see that. Yeah. That sounds super exciting. And I think thinking through some of the potential applications of some of that is going to be fascinating to watch. And we're probably coming up on a lot of these things sooner than we think, I would imagine. As you kind of look back over the things that you have worked on and maybe some of your career, is there anything that you maybe wish you would have known earlier that you know now, or that you have learned as you've gone through your career?
Not really. It's interesting. Not really. It's kind of interesting that a lot of the visions that have been put out there for the future are still valid. And I guess I'm thinking more about, you know, some of the more visionary researchers that kind of put forth ideas for like ubiquitous computing, that those are real and potentially, you know, still evolving in that direction. I mentioned earlier how I feel like we were much more optimistic 25 years ago, and now people are really getting, there's a certain exhaustion level with technology. But I'm not sure that I would have wanted to know that early on. It's more like living through that process was just part of it. You know, so I think the short answer is no, there isn't anything I wish I had known.
That's great. Going kind of along those same lines, you know, what advice would you give to somebody getting into UX or design now, or who's early in their career, kind of growing into it right now?
I guess I would say, hopefully choose it because it's your passion, not because you think it's a good, well-paying job. Because I think that you'll have a less of a tendency to want to stick with it if you do it just for a job. And I would say, you know, realize that there's a lot to learn, and that it's valuable to keep learning and have that kind of drive to want to keep learning. And like I said earlier, study up on sustainability and ethics, because they're really important, and there's really not enough attention paid to those.
Absolutely. Well, Dorothy, this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I do have a couple questions to wrap up, but before we do that, is there anything that we talked about or didn't get a chance to talk about that you want to add?
I think that we actually covered everything I don't really have anything.
Okay. Awesome. Well, you mentioned at the very beginning that you are an avid reader. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on anything that you have read or maybe watched or listened to recently that you'd like to share or recommend.
Well, so first I'll say I'm watching Succession, as is a lot of the world right now. And I do think it's amazing. I think the writing is just really good on that show. It's very, very impressive. So I recommend it. In terms of reading, I am currently reading something called Superintelligence, and by somebody named Nick Bostrom. He's an AI expert, and it's kind of a heavy read, very detailed, and a little bit dry, but it's essentially giving a very large overview of the field of AI. He's very concerned about the danger, and so that's what motivated him to write the book. And so that's a kind of major topic for him, is we need to make sure that we do the right things in order to and actually what he's saying is we need to instill artificial intelligence with human ethics in order to make it so that when it's more intelligent than us, then it takes care of us rather than destroys us. That's his basic premise.
Which there are some who are saying could be potentially already or coming up quickly. So those are very, very valid points and super important. We're going to add that. I'm going to add that to my reading list. I think that's a great one, and I have not read that one yet, so I love it. Great recommendation.
Okay.
And then, are there any products that you're using now or have been using that you'd like to give a shout out to? That could be a digital product or a physical product, anything that you've been liking.
Well, my family has 2 plug-in EVs. They're plug-in hybrids, and they are absolutely amazing and fantastic. And I highly recommend. They're both Toyotas. As it turns out, just decided it kind of worked for us. I know that a lot of people will say, well, electric cars aren't really ready yet. The technology's not there. They're overpriced. You have to wait for one, put an order in and wait for it, so people sort of are looking for all these excuses to say, it's not time yet. I mean, first off, I feel like the products don't get to be really good until people start using them. So I'm an early adopter of electric cars because I highly believe in them. And I feel like being an early adopter is really important in this case to push the technology along. But we feel like we just do so well with them, in terms of not buying gas for a few months at a time. We managed to just get by on the not huge amount of electric miles that there are on them, but we can make do with it for the most part. So I highly recommend that people get interested in electric cars.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is probably another topic, but whenever I see those arguments, like we're essentially arguing about that adoption curve, basically where we have the early adopters, and it feels like everybody who's arguing is arguing basically in the idea that they're not ready because the technology is not ready. But like you said, like the technology doesn't get ready until we push it further so that it's there and more people can adopt it. And it's almost a chicken and egg process, but like there is, once we can jump that chasm or that gap of, both the technology and the people are ready, then you start to get more options, better options, and more availability of places to charge and just a more, all of the things become easier. So like, as we're able to push it forward, it becomes less costly, less onerous for everybody. And so it's just better all around. Yeah.
And even so, I mean, considering that, we bought our first one 2 years ago, I don't in any way feel like we overpaid. Like, I feel like the benefits of these vehicles has way outweighed what we paid for them. So
yeah. And it's got to feel great not having to go to the gas station. And
it feels incredible. Right. Absolutely. And then, when you add solar to it, then you feel really good because you're just using the sun to charge up your car.
To charge it. Yep. No, that more and more sounds like an amazingly good setup. So I definitely can understand. Well, Dorothy, this has been, again, an amazing conversation. And I feel like we almost keep touching on things where it's like we could go on for more and more time. We could go on. I know. And I absolutely love it. But where can people find out more about you, the things that you're working on, anything else?
Well, so Boston UX website, ICS website. Also, I'm on LinkedIn. So those are probably the best locations.
Okay. And we will put all of those down in the show notes so you can check those out and check out what Dorothy is working on and connect with her on LinkedIn. And Dorothy, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for all of your insights and for talking with us today.
It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Okay. And thank you again, everyone, for listening. And we will talk again next time. Thanks again for listening. If you like the show, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can follow the show on Twitter @ProdByDesign. That's prod_by_design. You can follow me at Kyle Larry Evans on Twitter as well. If you want more product conversation, check out my newsletter, Product Thinking, at productthinking.cc. You can follow me on Medium at Kyle Larry Evans as well, or check out my Medium publication, Product by Design. Thanks again.